Some say he's a technical whiz. Some say he was born in Cornwall, while some say that he's on a journey. It's The Journey, and here's your host, David Hackett.
Hi everyone, another journey, and despite the technical difficulties, so if we do have technical difficulties when this is recorded, we do apologise in advance. But we do have a certified psychotherapist and certified transformative coach that has gone through the full journey from childhood trauma to addictions and mental health problems to jails and psychiatric care to 12-step recovery and becoming a professional helping others. His story is painful and eye-opening, showing how this system pathologizes normal human response to tragic life circumstances, and also showing how there really is a way out for everyone. Today, we welcome Jason Shiers to The Journey.
Hi, David.
Hi. Now, that bio there, that's a good journey. That's what's attracted me to interviewing you today. So let's start. And I know it sounds corny, and I've said it in a few of my podcasts now. We start with your journey as it began. And yes, the journey begins when you was born.
Yeah.
Well, what's your earliest memory possible?
Yeah. I don't know if it was just such strongly imprinted in my mind or whether it really was my first memory, but I can't remember anything prior, no matter how much I try and think about it, to my dad being killed and the police showing up at the door. And I answered the door that day to the two police officers, a man and a woman, stood there with their hats under their arms asking for my mum. And I was 5 years old then. And that's kind of the one that's, well, it's such an impactful memory, you know, it's kind of like and vivid. It's very powerfully etched in my mind. And it seems like that is I mean, it seems ironic that that's the first memory, but possibly it is, you know, I just don't seem to remember anything prior to that. And maybe just because it was such a big thing. But yeah, that was my first memory. And I guess that was the start of all the chaos, you know, where everything, the journey, so to speak, as you call it, you know, like obviously begins at birth. But to me, the journey where life took over and sort of took its course, you know, it's like, because you can never really know what's going to happen in life. And I guess in an idealistic world, you know, you get born into a family, you live a happily ever after, and then you die having had a good life, you know, if that's even true for anyone, I've no idea. But like, you know, you just you're not given any preparation for these tragedies, you know, or experiences. So from there on in, it was like learning to cope with a tragedy, with loss, with being a child left alone, really, you know, like to work it out, you know. It's kind of like, and when I asked you before about the best episodes, you mentioned love, you know, and I think that, you know, in we can put all sorts of psychological and spiritual theories, you know, over the top of experience, you know, what it means, what happened, how people learn to cope, and all those things. But the bottom line is that your heart closes, you know, and the love in your heart is, in a way, you're cut off from it, you know. That was my experience, you know. It was like, and I learned to protect my heart because it really wasn't safe to love, because people you love, they left you, you know. That's the innocent, unconscious decision that I made as a child, you know. And then I spent the next 20 years, you know, you could call it professionally escaping myself, you know. It's kind of like I learned every way possible to escape myself, in food for many years. At first, you know, there was lots of arguments about food because I used to steal and hoard food and compulsively eat myself till I gained masses of weight. And then as I got older and I was able to go out alone, I got into crime and chaos, just causing chaos. I was one of those children that should have had an ASBO, should there have been such a thing at the time. It's kind of like, because I just damaged everything and gave people abuse and caused trouble because I just, I was just in my constant escaping place. And then when I found drugs as a very young teenager, perhaps 13 years old, drugs just seemed the natural evolution of my experience, my progression. It was like that as I took drugs, it was easy to find money because I'd already been committing crime before I ever took drugs. So like, it just seemed natural to commit more crime, to get money, to take drugs, So I was well on the journey to destruction and devastation from an early teenager. And it's not because, none of this was lack of intelligence or anything. It was just a complete escapism. Nothing surpasses that, in the human experience of like our inability to cope with our internal experience, and that is byproduct of our conditioning. Whatever happens to us, whether we're brought up in adversity, in violence, in abuse, whether we suffer tragic loss, or whatever that adversity or struggle is, it's intelligent. The system that we live in, the mind-body system, is intelligent, so it finds a way to cope in whatever circumstances. And sometimes that way that we learn to cope becomes our biggest problem in adult relationships, in adult life. So that was kind of what I did. I found a way to cope, and that did become my darkness. It became my shadow, my place of escape. So I took drugs as a way to cope with my experience. Drugs were never the problem. They were only ever the solution. They were the solution to my internal world, which was devastated since I was 5 years old. It was that's all there was for me. It was like almost like I had been born into this shitty life that I really had no choice about. I was a victim of. It's kind of like being born into this experience where everything just seemed shit, and I just wanted to escape from it. I didn't want to live, to be honest.
And I know, you're talking about escapism. It's a way of living your life without realizing it's real life. You live in the alternative life where you feel like the drugs help you get through the day, I assume.
Yeah, absolutely. That's how it felt. I mean, it was almost like, at some point it definitely became that drugs actually just helped me be normal, whatever my normal was back then. It was like without the drugs, it was a physical, dependence, but like also a mental obsession and physical compulsion as well, like to take more drugs. So it's like I had to take drugs just to be able to be not whatever my definition of normal was back then. So it was, and the growth of habitual patterns, just happens like that anyway. You find something that makes your internal world better, and it's like, oh, this is what I've been looking for my whole life. My whole life had been from when my dad had been killed, my first thoughts, to when my cognitive and rational development had happened, 7 or 8 years old, and I started thinking and becoming a victim, to my emotions developing full of darkness and shadow. It's kind of like to finding drugs, which then coped with everything, because the thoughts went quiet, the feelings went quiet. I got to eventually escape myself, which is what I'd been trying to do since I'd started thinking. So why was I not going to take more drugs? Of course, that's what I was going to do, because it was the only thing that ever made me feel quiet inside,
And less shitty in yourself.
Yeah, exactly. It was the ultimate answer to all problems in one. In one moment it happened, and that was it. There was, from that one moment of taking heroin, there was no going back. It was like, that was it. I was going to keep doing it.
So going into your late teens, and all it says about addictions, which we talked about, and mental health. Was the mental health, do you think, that due to the drugs, or was it just the accumulation of every anxiety that you bottled up when your dad died?
Yeah, I like to define mental health first before I talk about it. To me, mental health is not talked about in any of the any of the psychiatric understandings, what they talk about is mental illness, and I like to differentiate between mental health and mental illness, because they call it mental health, but actually it's the diagnosis and definition of mental illness. It's kind of like, and that's, to me, that's completely different to mental health. Mental health, to me, as I define it, is a place inside of us that's always okay, that cannot be damaged, cannot be taken away from us, I really have struggled with the system, what I wrote in my bio about normal human response to adversity being pathologized, turned into a problem that needs a solution. And I think in some ways the system perpetuates, the actual problem. It actually further creates or solidifies the idea of a problem that needs a solution. And there's no real looking at normal human response to tragedy, for example, in my case. It's kind of like just trying to cope with internal experience. So I mean, I was first given a mental health diagnosis, a mental illness, like depression, when I was 9 years old, and I was put on medication. That was when it started, but it continued right the way through. I don't differentiate between the two things, because mental illness and addiction is just a normal human response to adversity. It is like, if we're having we're in a state of chronic overthinking, and escapism, it's kind of like, then perhaps we could go to any psychiatrist and come up with a diagnosis for something. Could be, depending on how your body responds, could be anxiety disorder, could be depression, it's kind of like, and later in life, any of the personality disorders start showing up as all as a way of coping. Those behaviors are just coping mechanisms with internal experience. So I like to, in a way, share my experience of working in that world and kind of being a client, so to speak, in that world for many years too, but like seeing how I see it today, and how I work with people today, and how I help people see what's right with them rather than what's wrong with them, so I like to, that's why I like to define the difference.
Yeah, and I know when I was first diagnosed with a mental health problem, I was 15.
Yeah.
Now, I wasn't diagnosed on principle because they thought something was wrong. They had to assess me because they wanted to see why I was being the way I was, because I was in a lot of trouble when I was younger. But they wanted to diagnose me because they wanted to see if what I was doing was a mental illness or just, disorder, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And I've been classed as depressed and anxious ever since because of that early diagnosis. Now I have antidepressants. I'm meant to keep on top of them, and I feel, I keep on top of it. But in recent years, I feel like I don't want to take them. And that's ultimately what some people say, that will only make you worse if you don't take them. So I don't know if it's good or it's bad. So I just have to take them just to keep the good and to stop people saying, yeah, you're doing good.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess the doctors was going to say that to you. They're invested in you sticking to the medication. And I'm not a doctor, so I don't advise people on medication. But like, if you feel instinctively like you want to change something, then you should speak to your medical professional and kind of follow a guided route to weaning yourself off them. But I see the mental illness as it's a definition of where you are at the time. It's not a definition of who you are. I like to make that distinction. It's kind of like some people at some point in their life, medication is helpful. It's kind of like they're going through something so difficult, so much of a struggle. They feel so much pain. Life feels too challenging, then taking medication just gets you through that little thing. It is a description. The psychiatric diagnosis, in my mind, is a description of where you are at that time. It's not a description of who you are. And I think that's where the mistake is made quite often, that people take it as a description of who they are. It's not who they are.
And I know for myself, that was how I was then. It's not me. It's not me now, because I wouldn't be doing this sort of thing. That's how I see it. And that's why I like reaching out to people, because everyone has a unique journey.
Yes.
And that's what, like I said, that's what I like about your journey, because you've been through every life possibility that anyone would say that's a journey.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it goes into saying about jail and psychiatric care.
Yeah.
Now, that were two different ball games. Obviously, same similar situation in prison and psychiatric care. You are ultimately locked up. You can't go anywhere unless you're supervised.
Yeah.
How did you feel, for your perspective on these journeys? How did it affect you?
They just felt like endurance tests, I guess, for want of a better term. I mean, jail was more frightening, and violent and kind of stuff where, you were witness to violent episodes every day. And it was really like something that you had to just find a way to get through, in a way, in my mind, it's almost like being at war, like if people identify as having PTSD, for example, because they were constantly on the expecting to be killed or shot at or something, it's kind of like in jails and in the streets of addiction, it's kind of like you're constantly on guard, you're constantly waiting and watching for people to take something from you or something like that, or witness to some sort of violence or something like that. So the body, again, you further learn to detach from yourself. It's like from further disconnection. I mean, like sharing your heart is just not a thing. It's like when you're on the streets or in jail, it's never, you're never going to do that. So you just become more robotic and kind of separated. And the same with psychiatric care, in a way, you're in some ways, experiencing a psychotic episode of, whatever it is they're describing it with, and you're kind of in a mental state of somewhat confusion, medication, it's kind of like of multiple things. And I was just out of control. That's kind of how I was, at that age. I really was, suicide was optional. I was out of control. I couldn't, could never get enough drugs to satisfy my needs. And whether I was committing crime or being sectioned, it's kind of like that was just the route that I went down. And all of it was like a one long endurance test, just a way of coping. And really, I could see no way out at that time. It really felt like it was a endless, there was, I guess there was some glimmer of hope, I remember having the thought that, you'll remember like the TV show, This Is Your Life, where they show up with a book and stuff. It was kind of like one day I kind of thought, maybe one day, I used to always have this repeating thought or dream or daydream, that one day someone would pull up in a car and go, this is your life, it's kind of like, and hand me a bag of money and a house and a normal life, that's what it was, because like I lived on the streets or in a homeless shelter or in somebody's car or on somebody's sofa. It's like, that's how I lived, or in jail, one or the other. So it was like a bad dream in a way, like going through the whole thing.
Yeah, and the reality is, this is your life, and defining it at that time, it would be cloudy, it would be black, because you always would think there's no way out. Now, there is, but at the time, you could only see it as a far, far, far pinpoint, I would imagine.
Yeah. It didn't feel very hopeful, to be honest. I don't even know if I had. I mean, I must have had some glimmer of hope. Otherwise, I probably would have committed suicide. But, I went to rehab in the end. I lived in a homeless shelter. I mean, that's where I was when I moved to rehab. I lived in a homeless shelter, funnily enough, where no one who had drugs or alcohol problems was allowed, but everyone in there had drug or alcohol problems. It's the only people that end up in a homeless shelter usually, really. And so I went from there into rehabilitation. I would have done anything because I was so desperate not to continue living the life that I had. And I started going to 12-step meetings because they just told me that I had this unexplainable condition or phenomena or disease, as they described it, called addiction, that no one could explain to me, but like I must have it because of the way that I lived. And I needed to do these certain practices, in order to be okay. I needed to stay in the rehab for a certain amount of time and go through all this psychological learning, about myself. And then I needed to go to 12 steps for the rest of my life, every day or every other day. And, then I would be okay, and that's what I believed, and it was like, and I stayed in 12 steps for 22 years, from that rehabilitation center, which was in 1994. And, I guess my internal world got worse. It's like I got better on the outside. I mean, I'm ever grateful for 12 steps. My external world got so much better. I started businesses. I've got 2 children. It's kind of like loads of things happened. My life kind of developed in what you might call somewhat of a normal external life, but my internal world got worse as I took away the drugs. Food became my coping mechanism again, and then from food I got involved in crime and toxic relationships and all sorts of stuff, going backwards and forwards again, because you'd taken the drugs away, because drugs were my solution. They were never the problem. It's kind of like you're taking away my coping mechanism for life. Then, I was left with my own internal world to cope with. So that's kind of where I was in life. And that's why I started the journey to becoming a psychotherapist, and because I really thought, I've got more problems than addiction. I've got something else. I've got mental health problems, mental illness problems. I've got unexplainable childhood trauma. I've got all these disorders that I'd been told over the years, so I started going to therapy, but I also started training to become a therapist. And, that was a long journey that I went on for many years. And every time I got many qualifications in the psychological fields, in different areas, in cognitive, in psychodynamic, in person-centered approaches, in NLP. I had a long list of qualifications, but I never felt any happier. None of them really helped me. I mean, like, we made sense of it, and I had a framework for understanding human behavior, but none of it helped me personally. I was still suffering. I was still struggling.
Yeah. And I understand, and I'm not saying every psychologist or psychiatrist, but they always say they got problems of their own where they want to help people because that's their way of coping.
Yeah. I wanted to help people because I felt I'd been through a lot, but also I wanted to help myself, because I'd never found peace of mind or joy or contentment. I'd experienced no joy or no happiness in my own life. So I wanted to find that place of peace. And that's why I kept doing qualifications, because I thought if I just found the right one, because life really looked like it was about finding what was wrong with me and fixing it. That's how I saw it then. It really didn't look like anything else. And eventually I came to this place where I had you might call it a spiritual awakening, or I'm not too caught up with words, or a realization, or a noticing of what was already there. It's kind of like where I woke up. I went to America for this on my travels, and I met this guy, and I just woke up to this realization that my whole life was a thought story that I'd been telling myself every single day, that my life existed inside of me and not outside of me. It wasn't about getting anything from the outside to make the inside better. It was about realizing the fundamental functioning of my own mind, of how I created the perception of the outside world via my own thinking, and how I, as I said at the start, closed off my own heart to love, to everything. It's kind of like, and really just spent my whole life trying to protect myself with this paradoxical experience where I seeked for and longed for love, but I was frightened to death of it. It's kind of like I didn't know what to do with it because of what had happened in my childhood.
So going into we talked about the past, we talked about kind of the present. How do you see things developing for the future?
My life feels like a beautiful adventure now. It feels very different, and I don't struggle, and I have experienced a lot of joy and a lot of contentment, a lot of love, and a lot of connection in myself and in other people in more recent years. the future is like, what I see about it is that I think, let me explain this a little bit. So I think that many people are fearful of the future, it's kind of like, and they feel like they have to stockpile something, in order to be okay later, it's kind of like, they try to create the mind, the human mind tries to create certainty by doing. If I keep doing these things, then I'll keep getting that thing that I've got, and then if I keep getting this thing that I've got, then I'll be okay. It's kind of like, or I have to have a certain number, a completely arbitrary number that's made up in the bank to be okay. But I don't think certainty, what I've realized is that certainty doesn't come from outside of yourself. It can't come from doing anything. It can't come from any number in the bank. Certainty to me now comes from the knowing that I have the resources inside myself to respond to whatever life gives me. And that's where my certainty comes from. So I could lose my job, lose my house, lose anything and be okay. It's kind of like, and I think that is where I don't get too caught up in the future, because actually the future in a way looks exciting because it's completely unknown. It's kind of like, and I like to leave it that way. I have no idea what's going to happen, who's going to show up on my calendar, who am I going to meet, what's going to happen, what adventures and journeys I'm going to go on, but I know I'll be okay. And that's the good thing about it, that I'm no longer frightened to death, to go out of the house because of what's going to go wrong. I don't see it like that anymore.
Yeah. So, because obviously people would like to get in contact, how would people be best get hold of you if they want to contact you?
My website, wideworldcoaching.com, would be the best place to find me.
Okay. And I'll make sure I put that in the link down below when it's post-edit.
Yeah.
So, to summarize, what would you say to people now to build them for the future, to make them know that they are not alone?
Yeah, I mean, it can be frightening, but like to go on the journey inwardly, it's kind of like you will never outrun a bad childhood or childhood adversity or the struggles or the conditioning that you receive earlier in your life. You can't escape it. It will always catch up with you. It's just not even possible to escape it. So, and the most rewarding thing you can do in your life is not about things. It's not about getting more money or getting more houses. They're just the things we do to try and avoid ourselves. Osho, I love Osho, and he said, everyone is doing the best they can to avoid themselves. And this best they can is they call having a good time. It's kind of like, and what he's basically saying is that everything that we're doing out in the world, trying to acquire more, get more status, get more money, get more bigger house, better car, all these things, is all in service of avoiding something inside of us. So what I say to people is go on that journey inwardly, go on that journey to know who you are, to know yourself intimately. It's like, because it'll catch up with you one day, and when it does, it's not a nice experience, but the journey can be beautiful. It can be loving and it can be rewarding, and you can meet so many great people. It's kind of like when you go on that healing journey to know who you are.
Mm-hmm. Jason, thank you for sharing your journey with us today. We will make sure we put your website in, like I said, afterwards.
Awesome.
But carry on with the good work. Let's hope your words will help others today.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was The Journey, hosted by Wise Words Imaging, hosted by David Hackett. Be sure to like, subscribe and listen to another journey coming soon.